to go into the types of awakening now. So I shared my personal story about the event that took place, and some of you might not have experienced something like that, and that's totally fine because it's not all the same. There's also, as you can see, different types of spiritual awakening. So a spiritual awakening, the way that people usually explain a spiritual awakening is that it's a gradual process where you start to question the nature of reality. You start to question your identity, and you start to feel the subtle sense of a connection to something greater. And you start to gravitate towards this unknown. You're not sure what it is. You feel that something's there, but you just gravitated towards something. You're questioning the normal, everyday side of things that you've been taught. That's a spiritual awakening. The spontaneous spiritual awakening is the experience that I had. For example, it's a sudden shift where you just change immediately. You move from what feels like a separate self, which is like an individual self, to an interconnected unity. You feel one with the universe, one with everything. You hear a lot of people that have had this experience explain it like that, and this overwhelming feeling of unconditional love. It's very spontaneous. And the thing is with these experiences, they're so compelling that wherever you have that experience, for example, I had my experience while listening to a philosophical talk. So for me, there's no doubt in my mind that it's linked to philosophy. And it's really hard for me to shift that belief and to kind of see that it's actually not just in that, it's in many other things. So for example, if someone has a spontaneous spiritual awakening in the church, it's really hard to convince him otherwise, that there's other stuff out there where people are having the same experience, but just through different methods. And it's like, no, this is the way that it has to be. You can't have it without being in a church or being in an ashram. And you can get quite caught up in your own story, because a lot of that is you're just trying to protect this experience you had. You're trying to keep it real to yourself. And it's really hard to kind of open that up and to see that there's many avenues, there's many paths. And one of the things that happens with these spontaneous spiritual awakenings, they it's a peak experience, which feels better. It feels more extreme than the slow gradual effect. And like I know a lot of people that have had the slow gradual effect wish they had the experience that I had. But in saying that, I can understand why, because of this ecstatic high. But the thing is, the integrative process is a lot harder, because the spiritual awakening in this gradual approach, you are moving towards something step by step, and your intuition is calling you to take certain steps, and each step you take, your intuition gets louder and louder, and by the time you reach these certain points, you're integrated already, you're already there. Whereas the spontaneous spiritual awakening for me, I had this big insight and reached the peak, and then eventually that peak just slowly closes, and then I'm back into this normal everyday life, and I've had this recognition of something far greater, and then trying to integrate that into everyday life becomes a big challenge, the biggest challenge actually. And that's why I'm so devoted to spending my time doing this research, to help people that have had those types of experience integrate these spiritual awakenings, because they can be really challenging. You can for me, I ended up back in a culture that didn't really support this spiritual insight. It was more about the materialistic worldview, and I'm the only one that is kind of in that at that time, with the group friends that I had and the work that I was working in. No one else was really viewing the world from a non-dualistic perspective. They were all materialists, and I remember just feeling very isolated and doubting myself a lot. And to go into the third stage, which is spiritual transformation. So spiritual transformation is when you start to integrate the spiritual awakening. You start to embody this newfound truth that you found. So both spiritual awakenings and spiritual awakenings need to move into the spiritual transformation, where we start to, integrate all these insights that we're getting, and all these new truths that we're finding, because integration and transformation is, the most important thing on this path. to speak about this phenomena, this spiritual awakening. It's not just a spiritual awakening. It's known across many cultures. It's not new. It's been recorded since the beginning of time, basically. We're talking like as far back as you can go into the beginning of writing. People have recorded spiritual awakenings, and in the Islamic culture, they refer to the term baraka, which is their definition of spiritual awakenings. In Zen Buddhism, they talk about satori, and it means sudden enlightenment. It's just a flash of insight where you, again, feel this sense of connection to the cosmos and the universe, and you transcend the physical form, just your personality, you could say. In Eastern traditions like yoga, they talk about samadhi, which is the state of union that you reach through devotion and practice. In Christian mysticism, they talk about what we already spoke about, which is grace, divine grace specifically. And in Buddhism, they talk about nirvana, which is the same concept of this instant moment of liberation. So throughout cultures, they've been talking about this for years. One specific culture that speaks about this in a really good way, it's in a specific method, is something that I really gravitate towards because I feel like it explains everything that I just explained in a really simple form. And that is in Kashmir Shaivism. So Kashmir Shaivism is a non-dualistic school of thought also. And they talk about these methods called the upayas. It's the 3+1 approach. And it's really interesting why they call it the 3+1 instead of the 4. And I'll explain that why. So the first upaya is anavopaya. And that's the beginner's path where it focuses on, physical practices like postures, breath control, meditation, until you reach a state of samadhi. So it's, the beginner's path. That's what they talk about with anavopaya. They talk about a more advanced path, which is shaktopaya, which is all about focusing your willpower and your energy on transcending ordinary consciousness. So it's bringing the mind to kind of transcend, but you have to be at a certain level of discipline to be able to do that. That's why they say Anavopaya is more the beginner's path, because you have to focus on breath control practices, postures, meditation to tap into the more subtle realms. And when you get into the more subtle realms, you can practice more Shaktopaya. And then when you get to even more advanced levels, like the highest level, which is Shambhavopaya, that's more focusing directly on your connection with the divine. It's just, boom, you just settle into it, and that's it. But again, they're all levels to reaching that state. The interesting one is Anupaya, which is the hardest level because it's impossible to achieve, because it's a method of no method, and it involves effortless, spontaneous recognition of the true nature of who you are. And that's the experience that I explained that I experienced. I was not meditating before that. I was not doing anything. I just got blessed with this experience of grace and didn't do anything whatsoever. I could never try to get it. And that's the whole thing about Anupaya, is it's the hardest level, but the hardest level, and what it means by that, it's because it's impossible to achieve. You can't go after it. It comes by sheer luck. Again, someone's walking down the street and poof, all of a sudden, an enlightened experience. But the reason they call it the hardest level is because of the integration process. Again, all these other three are all you're developing along the way, and by the time you get to the highest level, you've already embodied these certain aspects. Whereas Anupaya, just there you go, you've had the supreme insight. Now go back to your normal everyday life and try and get on with things. It's really hard.